Today we are going to talk about the fundamental attribution error. What exactly is the fundamental attribution error, and why is it so important? Let's look at an example. Say your friend Bob takes you to a party, and at that party he introduces you to his other friend Eric. Eric is particularly curt and seems uninterested in meeting you. He comes off as unfriendly. Chances are your first reaction is to assume Eric is just an unfriendly person. A real jerk, if you will, right? Well, what if Eric is just having a really tough day? Maybe he broke up with his girlfriend, or maybe someone close to him has passed away. Then you may think Eric's behavior is excusable because, well, he's just having a bad day. I guess Eric isn't that bad a guy, huh? Well, this mix-up in judgment is a perfect example of the fundamental attribution error. In other words, people tend to place more emphasis on internal explanations rather than considering the circumstances. So next time you meet someone at a party, don't be so quick to judge them.
When we think about learning, we often picture students in a classroom or lecture hall, books open on their desk, listening intently to a teacher or professor in the front of the room. But in psychology, learning means something else. To psychologists, learning is a long-term change in behavior that's based on experience. Two of the main types of learning are called classical conditioning and operant or instrumental conditioning. Let's talk about classical conditioning first. In the 1890s, a Russian physiologist named Ivan Pavlov did some really famous experiments on dogs. He showed dogs some food and rang a bell at the same time. After a while, the dogs would associate the bell with the food. They would learn that when they heard the bell, they would get fed. Eventually, just ringing the bell made the dogs salivate. They learned to expect food at the sound of a bell. You see, under normal conditions, the sight and smell of food causes a dog to salivate. We call the food an unconditioned stimulus, and we call salivation an unconditioned response. Nobody trains a dog to salivate over some steak. However, when we pair an unconditioned stimulus like food with something that was previously neutral, like the sound of a bell, that neutral stimulus becomes a conditioned stimulus. And so classical conditioning was discovered. We see how this works with animals, but how does it work with humans? In exactly the same way. Let's say that one day you go to the doctor to get a shot. She says, "Don't worry, this won't hurt a bit," and then gives you the most painful shot you've ever had. A few weeks later, you go to the dentist for a checkup. He starts to put a mirror in your mouth to examine your teeth, and he says, "Don't worry, this won't hurt a bit." Even though you know the mirror won't hurt, you jump out of the chair and run screaming from the room. When you went to get a shot, the words, "this won't hurt a bit," became a conditioned stimulus when they were paired with the pain of the shot, the unconditioned stimulus, which was followed by your conditioned response of getting the heck out of there. Classical conditioning in action. Operant conditioning explains how consequences lead to changes in voluntary behavior. So how does operant conditioning work? There are two main components in operant conditioning, reinforcement and punishment. Reinforcers make it more likely that you'll do something again, while punishers make it less likely. Reinforcement and punishment can be positive or negative, but this doesn't mean good and bad. Positive means the addition of a stimulus, like getting dessert after you finish your veggies, and negative means the removal of a stimulus, like getting a night of no homework because you did well on an exam. Let's look at an example of operant conditioning. After eating dinner with your family, you clear the table and wash the dishes. When you're done, your mom gives you a big hug and says, "Thank you for helping me." In this situation, your mom's response is positive reinforcement if it makes you more likely to repeat the operant response, which is to clear the table and wash the dishes. Operant conditioning is everywhere in our daily lives. There aren't many things we do that haven't been influenced at some point by operant conditioning. We even see operant conditioning in some extraordinary situations. One group of scientists showed the power of operant conditioning by teaching pigeons to be art connoisseurs. Using food as a positive reinforcer, scientists have taught pigeons to select paintings by Monet over those by Picasso. When showed works of other artists, scientists observed stimulus generalization as the pigeons chose the Impressionists over the Cubists. Maybe next they'll condition the pigeons to paint their own masterpieces.
The Gestalt principle of perception allows us to make sense of an entire object. So to see a whole object, the brain has to make all kinds of rules and use all kinds of information to do that. The principle of figure ground is simply the idea that we're going to pull out an object of interest and see everything else at a background. So for example, if you're at a restaurant talking to your friend, you're going to pull them out as the figure, and all the other competing information behind them becomes the background. And this is really important because if you couldn't pull the friend out, if your brain couldn't do that, you would be very confused. There would be so much visual information, you wouldn't be able to make sense of what was going on in the environment. So the brain tells us what's important, and then we focus on that as the primary figure. So in most cases, figure and ground is a law that we use quite well and quite easily. Every once in a while, though, the brain gets confused. And when you have these sort of optical illusions like the vase-face problem, where the brain isn't sure what to pick out as the figure and what to pick out as the background, some confusion results. And that's why we enjoy looking at a lot of those optical illusions, because we like the feeling of having the brain tricked and fooled. But luckily, it's only these special images that are going to fool the brain. As we walk around from day to day in everyday life, the brain is going to use the principle of figure ground, and we are not going to be confused by most of what's in our environment. Proximity is the idea that if objects are close together, we tend to group them together. So if you had a whole bunch of circles, but some of the circles were closer than others, we would tend to see those circles that were close as a grouping of circles. And it's a way for the brain to make sense of what it's seeing. The brain prefers the simplest response, and it's much simpler to see objects that are close together as being one object. So similarity is the principle that if objects are alike, the brain will group them together. So for example, if you had a row of circles, a row of triangles, and then a row of circles, your brain would probably naturally read those as horizontal. It would group all the circles in one line and then all the triangles in another, as opposed to reading it vertically. The brain wouldn't say, oh, there's a vertical column of a circle, triangle, circle. So the principle of closure is the idea that sometimes we see an image where not everything is filled in. For example, you might have a triangle that's really a series of dashes. It's not completely connected. But your brain would still prefer to see it as a triangle because it's going to fill in all the missing areas. It will close up the gaps because one triangle makes more sense to the brain than a whole bunch of angled dashes would. So continuity is the idea that the brain would prefer to see a continuous flowing motion as opposed to a bunch of separate smaller parts. So the principle of contiguity is the idea that if you have two things that are presented close in time, the brain is going to attach them as being somewhat connected, and we're more likely to see that as one unit.
Molly isn't a very confident person. She feels pretty insecure and is usually convinced that she'll fail at something. When she succeeds, she's pretty surprised. Molly is suffering from low self-esteem. Self-esteem is how you feel about who you are as a person. It's often referred to as confidence in yourself. For people like Molly, self-esteem can feel like something that just can't be reached. But low self-esteem can have a detrimental effect on people. Molly, for example, doesn't like to try new things because she's convinced that she'll fail. But if she tries, she might find something that she's really good at. For this reason, many people believe that high self-esteem is very important. Let's look closer at self-esteem, particularly the self-esteem movement and the things that improve self-esteem. Molly struggles with her self-esteem, and it seems to hold her back since she doesn't try new things because she thinks she'll fail. In 1969, Nathaniel Branden wrote a paper called The Psychology of Self-Esteem. In it, Branden argued that self-esteem is the key to success in life. According to him, successful people have high self-esteem, and therefore, if you boost a person's self-esteem, you'll also boost his or her success. To Branden, Molly's lack of self-esteem will keep her from being successful in life, so she needs a dose of self-esteem stat. So popular was Branden's paper that it spawned something called the self-esteem movement, where parents, teachers, and psychologists focused on boosting children's self-esteem.